But slowly, militia in these areas near the coast were learning about the invasion. So men were coming out. There were groups of maybe 50 men or 100 men, and they were coming out. They had no idea that they'd be seeing this great British fleet with their great cannons. And of course, the Virginians did not have great cannons to oppose them. Some of the militiamen had muskets. Some of them had swords. Some of them had hatchets. They were not well equipped, obviously, to take on the British. So they came. There were some skirmishes, but wisely they fled. They did what they could. They wanted to warn people upriver what was happening. That was the best that they could do. Now, they went a little bit further upriver. And all this while, keep in mind, Jefferson still doesn't know what's happening. They go a little bit further upriver, and at this point, Arnold once again sees a group of militiamen, and it's the area on the James River not too far away from Williamsburg. And in Arnold's mind, though he knows that Williamsburg is not the capital anymore, that's Richmond, he's thinking of going into Williamsburg because maybe there'll be more treasure to seek there. And he sees this group of men, various described, maybe it's 175 men, and he sends a message to the men, basically give up. However, this group is led by a man named Thomas Nelson, who later became governor of Virginia, the great planter of Yorktown. And Nelson says that he will not give up. And then he finds out it's Arnold, and he says, Arnold is the man in charge of this fleet. I will not surrender to Arnold. I'll surrender to his second in command if I surrender at all. Now, how do we know the detail of this? There's another journal that some of you may be aware of that's a very important source for this book, and I give it great credit in the book. And that's the diary of a Hessian officer named Johann von Ewald. And Ewald's diary was not found until after World War II and was not translated and published until the 1970s. So a lot of histories of the Revolution obviously do not contain his observations. And a lot of biographies of Jefferson, I haven't seen it used in those, but I had constructed this long chronology of events, and a lot of the events that I write about take, of course, over 5 years or so, and then I read the diary of Johann von Ewald, and it was just a great revelation, and I think it's one of the great documents of the Revolution. It's been used in histories of battles to the north, but I think it's very valuable, and I used it extensively in writing this history of what happened here in Virginia. So Ewald is on the ship, and he sees that a message has been given to Arnold from Nelson saying, I won't surrender to you, but if I surrender at all, I'll surrender to your second in command. And Ewald describes the scene and says that Arnold had a very upset look on his face as he read this message and describes this in detail. So I thought that gives us a new perspective on what Arnold is observing. Nonetheless, the British have at this point 1,200 men, 400 still lost at sea. They could easily overtake the men on shore. However, very fortuitously, there's a man in a nearby wood who'd gone hunting, and this man's name is George Wythe. You may know him as one of the great teachers and mentors of Thomas Jefferson. It just so happened that George Wythe had gone hunting partridge with 2 of his friends on this very day. And he may not have known that there was an invasion fleet or that it'd be nearby, but he saw there were some ships, and he decided to, as it was later described, pop off a few rounds. And you can only imagine, Arnold's on this ship. He sees in front of him a modest militia corps, but in the wood, there's shots going off. He doesn't know if it's a man shooting a duck or another militia force waiting to come after him. So Arnold feels the breezes, looks up at the sails, and realizes that perhaps it'd be best to go onward, that there's better treasure to get up towards Richmond. So at this point, he leaves, and Nelson and his men are safe, and very heroically, they have, with a little bit of luck, fought off Arnold. Now, it's a very important part of the story, what happened next. And that is that, I don't know if you know a particular spot called Hood's Point, but if you've been on the James River or you've gone on the roads near it, you know the James starts as this great funnel, and then it narrows inwards in sort of serpentine bends. There's a point on the James River, right, I'd say maybe 35 miles or so from Richmond, where it narrows particularly, and there's a high point of land. And that point of land, this promontory, is the perfect place to establish a fort. Thomas Jefferson had realized this would be the ideal place to stop an invasion. A year earlier, he had asked the legislature to look into building a great fort on this site. And if you know anything about politics or legislatures as I do, it will not surprise you what happened next. They studied the issue, they considered it, but by the time Benedict Arnold and his men arrived at Hood's Point, there was but a shell of a fort, and only 90 men manning it. No match for the 1,200 men and the great cannon of Arnold's fleet. So very quickly, when the men looked down and saw this vast fleet in front of them, they decided that they would take the back road out, and Arnold's men quickly took over the fort, and they had passed the great barrier that should have been and made their way towards Richmond. They went around the bend, and then they stopped at a plantation, and they all disembarked. And this plantation, some of you may be familiar with it, it's a great house known as Westover. And Westover is the house of William and Mary Byrd, one of the most beautiful estates in Virginia, if not the country. And at this great mansion, Arnold disembarked, rode up on his horse up the lawn, so it said, and they started to set up camp. Now, Arnold knew the owner of this house. Mary Willing Byrd was the first cousin of Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen. So he knew around that bend what would be waiting for him. Whether they'd made prior arrangements, we'll never know, but I do tell in great detail in this book, in fact, it was an obsession of mine, to tell the story of Mary Willing Byrd to try to explain some of the long-standing controversy over whether she committed treason. And I go into great detail in the book about the role of her and her husband and then what later happened, because I thought it was a fascinating story. And I try to interweave a number of stories like that in the narrative to explain what happens as the climactic scenes occur. So they're getting ready for their camp at Westover, and they've spilled over to the neighboring estate of Berkeley, the home of the Harrisons. But at that point, one of Arnold's fellow British officers suggests that perhaps it's a good idea not to stop, but to go by the back route towards Richmond, not by river as Jefferson might be expecting it, but to go by the back way, not rest, but to go quickly and take the capital by surprise. And Arnold, of course, had done many missions for the Americans and had experienced similar situations where the lack of surprise undercut the effort. So in this case, Arnold agreed, and they took 900 of their men, and they went by the back way. And after a long night's march, they easily defeated various sentries at bridges and river crossings and things like that. They arrived in Richmond. And by this time, Jefferson finally has gotten word that a great invasion fleet is underway. He's called out in increasing increments more and more militia. And they know that the British are coming. They just don't know when and how many people will be arriving. Now, Arnold's plan is not to go sneak in at the last second through the woods, but he decides he wants to make a great show of force. So he goes, when he gets to Richmond, he then takes the main road so that the people of Richmond can see this long train of very well-dressed and well-armed British and Hessian soldiers and officers. And there are some small militia groups that are on the hills of Richmond, but they are no match for the great force that Arnold is leading, and also that's led by his Hessian compatriot, Johann von Ewald. There are others there as well, but it's just a brief battle, and in the end, the militia have to flee. They just have no choice. Jefferson has been at his townhouse during this time. He realizes that it's a hopeless cause. So at this point, and the book could easily have been called Flight from Richmond as well as Flight from Monticello, because there are numerous flights from Richmond that occur. At this point, Jefferson decides the best thing to do is to take care of his wife and children. And I take a lot of effort in the book to try to give you a better sense of his wife, Martha, and the importance that Martha plays in many of Jefferson's decisions. As some of you may know, Martha, the letters to and from Martha by Jefferson have all been destroyed. There are no letters remaining, unfortunately. But I thought it was very important because I saw time and again Jefferson was taking extreme care to take care of his wife and children at the most incredible moments. So I tried to use other sources that give me some sense as to who were the children, what happened to them, where was Martha, what did people say about this at the exact time. So I've tried to weave that in. And this is a good example of that. Jefferson, he knows the British are there and that he personally can't do anything to stop them, and that probably the militia cannot stop them as well. He takes them up the river to a place called Tuckahoe, where Jefferson had lived as a boy, and thinks that'll be a place of safekeeping. A little bit later on during this Richmond invasion, Jefferson becomes concerned that will be taken by the British. And in fact, he's right. The British do eventually go there. He takes them further up to another place owned by the Jefferson family called Fine Creek and leaves them there. And there they are safe. He may very well have saved them from being captured, or who knows, maybe even killed. So I look at this and I see Jefferson not acting in a cowardly way as some have accused him. Clearly he's ineffectual. He has not planned for the invasion or stopped the invasion. But that's different from being a coward. He is on his own, taking his family up the river repeatedly, and then he comes back, and he's unassisted, he says later, by a single military aide. He can't find the ranking Continental Army officer in Virginia, and he personally goes up and he says, let's hide the papers here. Let's take the arms from the factory and hide them there. And for 3 days, he's running around Richmond on horseback. At one point, he describes going through the night, a very rainy night, by himself, trying to call out militia, get people to come out. So clearly he hasn't prepared properly, and he's the wrong man for the job, as he himself would say. But given the circumstance, he's clearly doing the best he can, and he's not a quiet, shy man. He's a man riding around on horseback all through the night, night after night, trying to do the best that he could. So I try to give him due credit and understand what's going through his mind, given that he put himself in a poor position, what he's trying to do for his family and for Virginia. So I thought that was very remarkable.